First off, it's literally been forever since I've done an edgy manga video. Today's theme is killers, from slashers to serial killers and everything in between. And since it's been a while, I'm going to go over the format. On Edgy Manga Reviews, we grade each series on a scale of least to most edgy, along with a recommendation either to read it or skip it. Anyways, we've wasted enough time as it is. Let's cut into some killer manga. Hideout is a manga that you can finish in an afternoon, and actually is pretty satisfying. Written and drawn by Kakizaki Masasumi, Hideout essentially starts as a thriller movie. Seiichi and his wife have a troubled marriage since the death of their son, Jun. He plans a trip for them to a tropical but remote island. While there, the two of them get caught in the rain, but that's when Seiichi reveals his true plan. He brought his wife all this way just to kill her. However, he soon realizes something much scarier. He's not alone on the island. And not only was there a witness to his wife's murder, but a dangerous witness as well. Seiichi is caught off guard by a maniac hermit that had been using this cave as his own blood-drenched hideout. And from there, the plot shifts into something closer to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or a slasher film, as one killer is pitted against another killer in a desperate struggle for survival. Hideout is so short that I almost don't want to talk about the plot, just so that I don't spoil anything. Honestly, in the amount of time that it takes to read it, you might as well have watched a 2-hour movie, and a really good one at that. The premise is so simple, but it's genius. Take a grounded thriller/true crime story, and then use it as the setup for a more over-the-top slasher movie. Then pit those two against each other. It's a great way to give us a protagonist that we want to see dead, as well as one that has a unique enough personality that he's not just slasher fodder. And while all this goes on, we're strung through a bunch of flashbacks. These not only give us more context to Seiichi's personality and motivations, but also explains the circumstances behind his son's death, and just who was at fault for that. It's almost like a side mystery, because we don't know from the start how he died. All that matters is that he did, and both parents blame each other. The flashbacks are drawn using much less shadows than the main story, which almost makes them feel like a brief breath of fresh air in an otherwise tense and fast-paced plot. This is a dark manga, like actually physically dark, with most of the locations being shadowy or grimy. And of course, this is all thanks to Kakizaki's fantastic art. He would follow up Hideout 1 year later with Green Blood, which I actually already covered in a previous video. His art is his strong points, and his stories less so. But whereas that was a problem for Green Blood's latter half, Hideout is so quick that it's consistent all the way through. As the story unfolds, there's a few twists and turns that keep you on your toes. It's constantly changing who has the upper hand in this situation. It's really good. It's like reading a good Stephen King book, and stopping before he does a bunch of cocaine and goes off the rails. Should you read Hideout? Absolutely. This is absolutely getting a read it from me. But just where does Hideout fall on the edge scale? Well, while the manga is incredibly violent, it's actually kind of low on the sexual violence. At worst, any sexual element is implied, or actually kind of consensual, which is why I'm going to put Hideout at a 4 out of 5 on the edge. Definitely for the violence and its psychotic main character alone, it earns this edge rating. It's a pure horror manga, not a horror comedy or one with action elements, just a horror from beginning to end. Okay, so frogs just might be my favorite animal. Or at the very least, they're really, really high up there. So imagine my surprise to learn that there's a manga with a serial killer that wears a frog mask and is hunted by a hard-boiled detective. It seemed like it was right up my alley, and it was. with a few caveats. So let's get into that. Museum is a mystery thriller manga about Sawamura, a police sergeant who is tracking the case of a serial killer that only kills when it rains. As his patterns become more clear, Sawamura realizes the horrible truth. His wife is on the killer's hit list. Now racing to save his family, he pits himself against the Frogman, even after he's thrown off the case. Published in 2013, this was written and drawn by Tomoe Ryosuke, and marks his debut as a manga artist, which is very telling because Museum feels just above amateurish. All the right elements are there: the cat and mouse chase between killer and detective, a more grounded, realistic art style, a mystery that unfolds as our main character makes new discoveries. And it's done pretty well. Frogman is a sort of jigsaw-like killer, in the sense that he hands out ironic punishments for his victims. Each kill, he changes the method and also the name of the punishment, which he writes on a scrap of paper and leaves at the scene of the crime. Early on, it's implied he's actually more of a vigilante, only killing people that he feels deserve it. But honestly, by the time we know what his motivations are, this notion is completely thrown out the window. And I really wish that I liked Frogman more. He has a great look, but his motivations and character fall into a more generic category. Without getting into spoilers, Frogman is an artistic serial killer, seeing his kills as art pieces. And if you've ever been into this sort of detective killer genre as long as I have, you've definitely seen this trope before. I actually don't mind it that much. The Mads Mikkelsen-led Hannibal show has some very memorable artistic killers, but that's the thing. Frogman feels like he would be a single-episode serial killer in Hannibal, not someone that can lead his own show. And it just feels a little derivative. In fact, a lot of the manga feels derivative of Western film. The plot, especially with the ironic punishments, is kind of like Seven. The down-on-his-luck detective that spends more time with his job than he does with his family is a tired trope by now. This inspiration becomes even more blatant in the 2 bonus chapters in volumes 2 and 3. These are earlier one-shots that Tomoe had published before the start of Museum. And the first one is literally Leon the Professional, while the second one is slightly more original, but has strong shades of I Know What You Did Last Summer. It seems like Tomoe takes Western films and likes using them as a springboard for his manga. And in principle, that isn't a bad thing, as long as you can make it feel unique enough. And maybe that's where Museum struggles, because it never seems to come out from the shadow of the thing that it was inspired by. But hey, maybe if you just want a short 3-volume package that feels kind of like other detective killer things that you've seen before, then this isn't a bad pick. Even if it's a bit cliche, Sawamura is a likable protagonist, and in the end you do want to see him come out alive with his family in one piece. The manga has multiple points where it could have gone full edge, points where if it did, I would have been soured by the whole experience. But it never goes too far, and still manages to keep the tensions high. Everything is wrapped up in a neat little package, which left me feeling pretty satisfied with it. So it's probably going to get a 3.5 on the edge. If you liked Seven, Saw, or even I Saw the Devil, then Museum might seem familiar, but it shouldn't disappoint. And if you liked Museum and haven't seen any of those movies, then what are you waiting for? Go check out I Saw the Devil and Seven. Those are absolute classics. And if that's not enough for you, the manga was adapted into a 2016 live-action film by Keishi Otomo, the director of the Rurouni Kenshin movies. Bringing us full circle, the film got generally positive reviews, but with many people unsurprisingly calling it the Japanese Seven. The 2 things that people react most to are sex and violence. I forget where I first heard those words, but it's something that always stuck with me, especially as I trudged through the tomes of less well-regarded manga. And there's no manga that exploits that relationship between sex and violence quite like Kyuusen no Shima. The title can be translated as The Island of the Abyss, or some have went with Hades Island, for that old-school sounding flavor. The plot is about Yuma, a young man visiting relatives on a remote island. His family, The Nue-Naki clan is an extremely influential force on the island, basically in control of the entire place. And his grandmother, the current head of the family, wants Yuma to succeed her. Yuma initially refuses, but when she's found murdered the next morning, he has no choice but to step up and become the clan's next head, even if that will put his own life at risk. Now Yuma has to navigate his duties as the new head of household, while also investigating the deaths and disappearances that crop up around the island, all while trying to keep his adoring older sister, Miharu, safe and sound. Oh, and everyone is insanely busty. I first read Kyuusen no Shima years ago on a whim, while I was on my phone, waiting for a tow truck to pick me up out of a parking lot in the rain. And since then, it's occasionally popped back into my head from time to time. The manga's most notable image, that of a busty bull-headed woman splattered with blood, is actually really striking. This alone sells the manga, blending sex, violence, and horror all at the same time. And while it sells the idea of the manga, it omits the smaller details. This is an ecchi manga first, and a folk horror/mystery manga second. Any details about the plot and mystery must be conveyed with tits or an ass on the screen at all times. Women's shirts and pants seem to vacuum seal onto them. And while absurd, I don't think the art is that bad, in the first half at least. For an ecchi manga, this is on brand. This is the type of art, and usually the type of women that you want in this sort of story. Kyuusen no Shima was written by Higashida Yusuke, who at first glance didn't write much until you look at his pen name, Minamida Usuke, who to this day is a prolific hentai artist. With that in mind, it's actually odd that Kyuusen no Shima has as much of a plot as it does for how honest it is about being an excuse to draw skimpy women. Maybe this was Higashida trying to branch out into different genres, not necessarily porn. But it's so brazenly horny that it might as well be porn. If this was straight up pornography, then the manga would be in the upper levels of porn for putting this much time and effort into its mystery. But because it's not, it's at the bottom of the mystery and horror manga ranking. Because of the absurd lengths that it goes to put our main characters into compromising positions, it might actually be more respectable as porn. However, it is completely honest with its intentions, never trying to trick you into thinking that it's more than what it is, which is basically an exploitation flick drawn into a manga. With that in mind, I think Kyuusen no Shima is actually pretty enjoyable for the first volume. And if you're one of those freaks that likes older sister types, then Miharu is definitely for you. While Yuma does take some initiative to move the plot forward, most of it does appropriately feel like he's the only person on the island that isn't in the dark on its secrets. It works to make him feel isolated and under watch. At least at first. Volume 2 changes this with an excessive amount of lore dumps written into the skin of two twin sisters. And once Yuma decides to actually step it up and act like the head of the clan, it's all over. This is more or less the point where the manga started losing me, where my suspension of disbelief started to become more strained, and where the art started to go downhill. A mastermind is revealed, and secrets are no longer secret as the manga rockets towards a fiery and bloody climax and then stops short. I guess it's an open ending. It's not like there was anything left to go over. It just feels abrupt, like a non-ending. And these few ending chapters really soured me on a manga that, despite its overindulgence, did have me hooked early on. It soured me so much so that I can't recommend this to anyone, even people looking to get off. This is going to be an absolute skip. And as far as Edge goes, it's going to be tied with Hideout as a 4 on the edge. There's piles and piles of dead bodies and named characters that die, but it's kind of softened by the etchiness, which in itself is kind of edgy, but it definitely feels like its priorities are elsewhere. So I'm going to change things up a little bit. Instead of tying together a loose theme, we're going to hand out some awards for the manga that truly excelled in their categories this episode. absolutely goes to Hideout. Kakizaki Masasumi is a wildly underappreciated manga artist, and Hideout is definitely a gem in his portfolio. While it lagged behind in the beginning, Kyuusen no Shima more than makes up for it with piles and piles in the end. Probably Hideout. Museum is the only other real contender, but I think Hideout in the end delivers a short, simple story that is propelled by a great twist. Again, Kyuusen no Shima has more examples than I could possibly ever count. Gonna give this award to Frogman, because simply, he is your archetypical edgy serial killer character, and there's nothing more edgelordy than that. It's Hideout. Hands down, if you're going to read anything in this video, read Hideout. You can do it in an afternoon, and you definitely won't regret it. And that's going to wrap up this edgy manga video. But as always, if you have any suggestions, please send them to me in the comments or email me at zetaijapanyt@gmail.com. Originally, this video actually wasn't going to be for J-Horror Month, but I just started making so much progress on it that before I knew it, it was ready to come out. That means that before J-Horror Month ends, I have one more video to release for you guys. It's about to get bloody as we dive into the history of Meatball Machine.